Elden Ring is a cracking computer game at a crowning point for developer FromSoftware. It's got all your favourite FromSoftware ingredients, dark fantasy, lethal combat, all manner of savage foes and grotesque bosses, corpse running, not knowing where best to put your skill points, and this time it all takes place in an astonishing open world. The famous Dark Souls difficulty is still there, but I've actually found it to be the most accessible FromSoftware game yet. This time around, the need to get good isn't quite as urgent, the game's introduction not as brutal and cruel as previous Souls games. Now, I should say I've yet to finish the game, so I don't know how much cold poo awaits me difficulty-wise in the final stretch, but so far I've been pootling smooth, and this is coming from someone with their fair share of skill issues. But so far what I've found to be Elden Ring's toughest challenge is figuring out where I'm supposed to go and what my objectives are. Not to mention the old faithful, ultimate, albeit optional challenge of figuring out what's going on. So the what are my objectives part is straightforward in a very broad sense. It's just hit the bad guys until they die, don't get hit by the bad guys and die. And then in between, pull all the levers, run through the unavoidable poison swamps, point at the dog, talk to the NPCs until they repeat themselves and then you find them dead somewhere, why is it always mushroom, and rump ahead, so be wary of fingers in the butthole. But as for what my specific objectives are, well, I'm not really sure. I had a vague sense early on that I had to whack these 5 main geezers, a bit like Kill Bill. I'm not sure who told me to do that though, it was so long ago. I think I've killed a couple already, although I think I might have spared one. I've no idea, and I've also got the sense that my path is leading me to the massive golden glowing tree in the middle of the map, but as to why, again, I've no idea. But I'm sure it's going to come into play at some point. The game is called Elden Tree after all, and I'm betting, given the cyclical nature of FromSoftware's previous Souls games, I'll probably end up becoming the new Elden Tree, or some kind of squid. We'll see, I guess, if I ever get that far. And as for the challenge of understanding what's going on, well, that's a classic FromSoftware challenge. What happened here? Why is everything all messed up and miserable? Who's in charge? What's with all the fingers? Why is that big pot talking to me? If you want answers to these questions, well, you better dig for 'em, son, because FromSoftware games famously never convey their narrative in a traditional sense. You know, with like characters having conversations with dialogue, narration, scenes, the kind of stupid boring stuff that stories usually have. Instead, they like to dish out the story piecemeal. You might be able to glean some plot points from the cryptic monologues of the wretched NPCs. It usually goes something like this. Oh, I didn't expect to meet someone all the way out here. Ah, I see you have valiant fingers. You must be tarnished. Better pleased with seeing yourself than the aspect of a cloven sister. Of that I am certain. But perhaps you have seen her on the road. We were separated afore the last singe. The heath is very treacherous these days. Such sweet piss. Do go on. My free time is not precious. And don't forget, there's always lots of story details buried in the game's clunky menus. There's a great many weapons, items and artifacts to be found on your journey through the lands with the trees, and each one has its own unique description, containing many intriguing details pertaining to the world's history and current circumstance. Though I believe one must read the unique description of each of the 2,000 odd items, and in the correct order, to fully understand what any of it means, and even then it's open to interpretation. It seems strange to me, hiding your story in fragments on the back of inventory. It's like if you went to the theatre to see a play and the actor on stage said, "You want to hear a story?" right before throwing all the stage props into the audience and saying, "Work it out from that shit." But in all honesty, I'm more than fine with subtle storytelling. FromSoftware's unobtrusive low-key narrative is definitely preferable to one that's prominent and shoddy. I mean, how many video games would actually be improved if their stories were scaled back and unobtrusive and the characters didn't speak? So while the story of the Elden Rings doesn't necessarily need to be clearly communicated, one thing that probably should be clearly communicated is where the player is supposed to go within the massive open world. And that for me has been the biggest challenge of Elden Ring so far. Simply not knowing where to go. Now, you might say not knowing is part of the fun, and you might well be right. I'll come back to that later. But I often play Elden Ring with a certain amount of doubt in my mind, rarely making progress with any kind of certainty that the path I'm taking is the right one. It reminds me of that feeling you would often get while exploring any number of RPG dungeons, when a forked path leads either to a dead end with a treasure chest, or a point of no return and an unskippable cutscene. You hope the path you chose doesn't lead to you missing that treasure. And that's the feeling I get playing Elden Ring most of the time. Like, I'm in the wrong place or I'm doing things in the wrong order, and if I carry on this way, I'll be locking myself out of content somewhere else. So usually I just follow the path of least resistance. If the enemies east only hand you your ass, or the enemies west hand you your ass and then tear you a new one, just keep going east. And believe me, the last thing I want is to clog up the map with waypoints, blips and checkpoints and objective markers like an Assassin's Creed orgy of odd jobs. But a little bit of guidance wouldn't go amiss, would it? And sure, the Sights of Grace supposedly guide you along the critical path, but eventually they point you towards inaccessible areas or just point you around in circles. And then you have to rely on the NPCs for guidance, which they do sometimes offer, if you're able to find them in their hiding places, that is. The really important characters are the most well hidden. You'll find them hiding in bushes or rooftops, and they'll be invisible. Now, this all sounds needlessly cryptic and perplexing like all of FromSoftware's games, but really that's part of the fun. It doesn't matter if your playtime is limited and you don't make any meaningful progress in a session, just embrace the mystery. I'm sure feeling lost and astray is a thematic game design choice. The way you interact with the game is actually reflected back at you by the game itself, similar to the combat in Bloodborne. A town where the residents begin turning into vicious bloodthirsty beasts. The player assigned the role of hunter must slaughter them all, with sharp-toothed saw blade and blood drunk, little more than a beast themselves. I get the impression there's a similar correlation in Elden Ring. The player is some kind of outsider, a tarnished warrior on tarnished ground, an outlander drifting across the broken terrain of the lands in between. So the feeling of being lost and off course seems quite fitting tonally. Finding sights of lost grace to then in turn be guided by them in a constant cycle of being lost and found. Perhaps that was FromSoftware's intention, for in order to properly explore the world of Elden Ring, one must first have to be lost. Either that or they made a massive fucking world and decided to just let the player figure it out themselves. Who knows?